Welcome back to Movies Are So Back, the YouTube movie review channel where I, Ethan Simmie, ask the question, are movies so back? Well, I am back, and we are continuing our weekly conversations and reviews about the new season of Severance, a show that I've waited many, many years to finally be talking about on a weekly basis. This week, we've got episode number 2 titled Goodbye, Mrs. Selvig. And you know, I am a human, just like my innie, and just like you. Man, this episode got dark. I gotta say, this episode got much darker than I anticipated it. Last week on my review, I was like, I think this show is going to get very dark over the next 9 weeks. And then it was like, no, we're going to get very dark next week, right away. So let's jump into the episode. Let's talk about the things that I liked, that I didn't like, and some predictions for the week after, and most importantly, the winners and losers of the episode this week. Now, I thought this episode was a good episode, not a great episode. And I watched it last night, and I walked away a little colder from it than I would have liked, that I would have anticipated. I've been thinking about it overnight over the last 12, 14 hours, trying to figure out exactly how I feel about this episode. And I think it's good, not great. I like I said, it got pretty dark, and I wasn't anticipating that. But the thing that I was not anticipating the most is the fact that it essentially took place all outside of Lumen. This is a completely lore building episode, in my opinion. And it's kind of a flashback episode because it kind of does take us back in time to before the events of episode 1 transpire, before Mark S. does go back to work for Master Data Refinement, before we get back into Lumen and that side of things. This episode brought us back to what transpired from the moment that Mark and everybody else resumed their Audi lives, and then joined back into work, which I thought was good. I thought was needed for sure, but there's just a lot to unpack, and it was a much slower episode than I had thought that they were going to give us. I think one of the most important things to talk about for this episode is the dynamic between Helena and Helly, of course, her Audi and her innie, and the dynamic that her character features with Mr. Milchek, with her bodyguard, henchman, crony, whatever you want to call him, the guy that has one of the 4 tempers tattooed on his hand, which is kind of crazy and begs more questions about how Lumen operates as a whole cult-ish company, and the relationship between Helena and Mrs. Selvig. And Mrs. Selvig in particular, or Mrs. Cobell, and her kind of genius and how she operates within the Lumen kind of tree of everything. And I thought the conversation between Mrs. Cobell and Helena was a great kind of Western standoff. I think that they are going to have an explosive relationship as this season progresses, and we just got a glimpse of it here because Helena knows that Mrs. Selvig is really smart. Sorry, I keep calling her Mrs. Selvig, Mrs. Cobell. This says something about where my brain is at for any Audi status and how I feel about the Severed, apparently, which we learn more about in this episode. But I think their conversation is really important because they're kind of playing chess with each other, and they're trying to figure out, and Helena offers Mrs. Cobell a position on the Severance Advisory Council, a brand new council that they are starting at Lumen, and Mrs. Cobell is like, I'll think about it. And I think they're just trying to suss each other out. And what I find interesting is that we kind of don't really know where Mrs. Cobell stands at the beginning of this episode and at the end of this episode. But that will lead me into my predictions for next week. So let's talk about a couple of other things. Like I said, this is really a lore building episode, which I found fascinating, albeit quite slow. We learn a lot about the outside world, how Helena functions as a leader within the kind of Lumen Corporation, and the key character distinction between Helena, her Audi, and Helly, her innie, is that people come to Helena. She demands the attention and the action from others. Her dad, Mr. Egan, walks to her. Other people come to her. Mrs. Cobell comes to the meeting room. These types of things. Whereas Helly, she goes to people. She goes to Marcus. She goes to Dylan. She explores Lumen. And there's this big kind of bifurcated nature in her core being. And I think that's really revealed when Helena watches the video of Helly R kissing Marcus. She pauses, she rewinds, she does it again, and she thinks, interesting, maybe there's something there that I'm happier inside than I am on the outside. And these character traits that I've developed out here versus the ones that I have in there when I am kind of unencumbered, when my guard is let down, maybe that is serving me personally better. And I think we're going to unpack a lot there as the season progresses with each character. And I think Helena and Helly are that's like our first kind of dichotomy that we get in exploring these outie-innie relationships. Mr. Milchick is a motorcycle man, and I respect that. And I think that's really cool. And I just, kudos to Mr. Milchick for being, again, a bifurcated guy who is not severed, which I think is really fascinating and really difficult from a performance standpoint, of course, but from like a character standpoint as well. Like, he has to be one person with Helena and Lumen, and he has to be another person when he's doing customer care, right? I would essentially deem it as customer care. I think they kind of reference that. If you tune in to the end of the episode, we get some information, some behind the scenes stuff about, from some of the creators, which I think is a great little nugget that, Max and HBO have been doing for a while on their shows, which I enjoy. But him basically going to everybody, laying them off, and then having to go back to everybody and being like, look, you're coming back. That is incredible stuff. And back to the motorcycle bit, just really cool. I just think Mr. Milkshake is a great guy. And, honestly, I kind of take a little bit of offense to calling him Mr. Milkshake now. He's really grown in my estimation of how much I like him as a character. And the greatest shot of this episode is the fade, the dissolve into Irv and him basically being at his home, and Mr. Milchick's motorcycle driving through his neck, which I just brilliant stroke from the creators of this show. Let's talk about Dylan's job interview, which I thought was hilarious and incredibly depressing and sad. And my guy Dylan is just trying to make a living. He is just trying to move forward with his life. He gets laid off by Lumen, by Mr. Milchick, and he just gets back out there. He's a grinder, man. And I respect that. And that's my boy. Dylan is my guy. And he's like, I've loved Doors ever since I was 5. I think incredible stuff. Zach Cherry is phenomenal in this role. And I thought this was the funniest the show has been in a long time, which I think it does remarkably well when it wants to, is be this kind of wryly effective humor. And how he wants to be like a semi-gloss finish on a door. He wants to be a pocket door. And then obviously, of course, this idea of Severance lore being revealed. And we're kind of doing a lot of world building in this episode about how the outie world feels about the idea of Severance and what that surgery actually entails. And we can see he gets denied for this job because he does mention that he was a severed employee. And so there is a stark divide in people who support Severance and don't support Severance. And this episode definitely takes a tonal journey, I think, and kind of a tonal shift to some prior episodes in the prior season, especially, where it's much more thrilling. It's much more of like a kind of a neo-noir thrill, kind of espionage, corporate drama. And I like that. It's just not what I was expecting. So I think I'm just personally having to warm up to it a little bit. And I would say that this tone is probably where most of the season is going to continue to go, because these are the things that will matter. And I see these things going forward, even into season 3 of this world really expanding and exploding and getting into some of the politicalness of Severance and how corporations view them, how people view them. And I can see that really being a big narrative driver moving forward. So it's cool to see the origins of something like that in such a small fashion, with Dylan applying for a new job. RIP, Dylan didn't get the job. Tough beat for my guy. Let's get a little big brain for a second about this Cold Harbor file. Now, this is kind of one of the last things that's mentioned in the episode about how they don't need chemistry. They don't need chemistry within the new MDR team. And we see how they gather these people and then eventually lay them off 3 days later. They just need Mark S. to return to work to finish the Cold Harbor file. This is going to be the driver of the season. This will be where episode 9 leads us to the completion of Cold Harbor and the fallout in episode 10, and then season 3 will pick up. That is my huge prediction for the kind of overarching Cold Harbor file that we're going to get into. Now, I did a little bit of Reddit digging, which is probably a bad idea for a show like this, but like I said, we're going to get a little big brain here, and this is what I found most interesting on the interwebs, is the fact that Cold Spring Harbor, New York, was the birthplace for eugenics and human hereditary research in the 1920s. Now, there are prognostications out there that Mrs. Cobell and Helena and Egan, all the way up to Kier, whatever Kier told his children, top down, somehow has to be related to Mark S. and Gemma and potentially building a better race, building a better people for tomorrow through these files that they work on, which is either chips or something to make people better, different, specified. I'm not sure, but I found that interesting. I found that kind of little bit of galaxy brain stuff fascinating. So I wonder what the Cold Harbor file is. I wonder where it takes us, but this is obviously going to be the key denominator in everybody's arc moving forward. My last thought that I want to touch on is what's the deal with pineapples? 2 episodes in a row now that we have had the mention of pineapples. In the first episode, we mentioned how there are better perks now, and one of them is a pineapple bob or bobbing for pineapples. Apple TV Plus, their account on Twitter, put out like a tweet that was like, oh yeah, pineapples, interesting. What the hell? What does it mean, Apple? Because then in this episode, obviously at the very end, Mrs. Selvig, Mrs. Cobell mentions, oh, Mark, they brought you back. What did they get or what did they promise you? Pineapple? Something's going on with pineapple. Are severed people trained to be submissive or enthusiastic when it comes to hearing the word pineapple, seeing a pineapple? Is that like a trigger word for them? Is that a safe word? I don't know, but it definitely means something. And I'm interested to see what it is. I don't get it yet. And I like where it's alluding to. I lied. That wasn't the last thing I want to talk about. There is one more thing. I love the intro for this. I think it is much, much better than the season 1 kind of animated intro. I think there's a lot more to kind of like freeze frame and ingest and take in and discover. And I thought it looked really phenomenal. So we didn't get it in episode 1, which was like a big thing. People are like, where's our intro? Got it back on this episode. And I'm curious to see if they alter it at all from episode to episode and kind of give us ideas of what might be coming down the pipeline. Let's talk about winners and losers for this episode. Winner for this episode, the loser of last week, Helly R, the person that I liked the least, has won this episode. Except it's not Helly R, it's Helena, because I love her character and her power and her dark power that she possesses and harnesses in this episode, and where she is leading us on, again, a more kind of corporatized drama thriller. I love that. I think that's interesting and starting to be something that I care about a lot. Loser for this episode, Rickon. Just all around, it was hard to watch my guy get ignored left and right by Devin, by Mark, by Mr. Milchek, and he was just there, trying to help himself out and tell himself that he, is nursing his child back to health. But the loser of the episode, I would have liked more Rickon, honestly, in this episode. And I hope we get more Rickon moving forward. He was funny. He's just the loser of the episode because people were a little dismissive of him. And I took that personally. Predictions for next week's episode. This is where I'm at. We end this episode with Mrs. Cobell in the car, Mark being like, what do they do at Lumen? And all she does is scream and honk and drive off. So I think this will lead us into Mrs. Cobell and Mark S. tag teaming, joining up somehow and being a dynamic duo. I think Mark is going to pursue Mrs. Cobell. And I think after their kind of minuscule falling out between Mark S. and Devin, this episode, I think they will reunite. I think Mark will go to Devin and say, Mrs. Cobell knows something. We need to seek her out. We need to find her. And that is kind of going to be like a mid-season journey to try to bring that together. In line with that, I think that they will try to topple Helena and out her and figure out her situation with Lumen, because Mrs. Cobell knows more than we know, knows more than she's told us that she knows. So, I think that is where we're going to go. We're going to see the team up. How do I feel about that? If that is the case, I don't know, because Mrs. Cobell was like a really good foil to Mark S. in season 1. But that's where we're headed. I hope, I guess, I don't know. That's where I predict that we are headed. Is TV so back? Yes, but less so than last week. Again, good episode. I don't think it was a great episode. I don't think it'll go down as like I got to rewatch that episode or anything. But important nonetheless to build out the world of Severance, of Lumen, and keep these reviews coming and keep the theories coming of what is going to actually be revealed the deeper we get into this season. So yes, TV is back. Remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you don't miss any of my weekly reviews of Severance, along with any other movie reviews, Oscar reactions, and things that I do and put out on the channel. You can also follow me on Letterboxd for any of my full-formed movie opinions, and I'll see you in the next video.